Warcraft begins long before Azeroth's kingdoms, before the Horde, and even before mortals shaped their own history. The real starting point is a cosmos split by competing powers, the ordered designs of the Titans, the corrupting reach of the Burning Legion, and the fragile worlds caught between them. That conflict explains almost everything that follows, because every major war in Warcraft grows out of an earlier struggle over who gets to shape reality itself. From there, the timeline moves from creation to corruption, from ancient cosmic wars to the rise of mortal races, and then into the conflicts that define Azeroth's own history. Titans leave their marks, demons spread chaos, the world's soul becomes a prize, and the peoples of Azeroth are forced into a series of battles they did not create. Once those first great clashes begin, the rest of Warcraft is just one consequence after another. Before there were mortal empires, there were already powers trying to define what the universe would become. In Warcraft's cosmology, the Titans stand for order. They shape worlds, bind dangerous forces, and try to impose structure on a reality that keeps slipping toward chaos. Against them are the Burning Legion and the demonic corruption behind it, which seek to unmake that order and drag every world into ruin. In between those two extremes sit the many worlds themselves, most of them unaware that they are already part of a much larger struggle. The Titans matter because they are the first major builders in the setting. They move from world to world, awakening and organizing planets that contain world souls, enormous latent beings that give those worlds unique importance. Azeroth is the most famous of these worlds, but it is not the only one the Titans touch. Their work includes creating facilities, ordering landscapes, and leaving behind guardians and systems meant to preserve stability after they move on. That approach is important, because Warcraft history is full of places where ancient Titan measures later become the foundation for entire civilizations. But the universe is not left alone after the Titans begin their work. The Void and the demonic forces connected to the Legion represent a much more destructive pressure. The Void seeks corruption, instability, and influence from within, while the Legion acts more directly, using conquest, possession, and outright annihilation. Even before mortal history begins, these forces are already shaping events through older wars in the cosmic background. The result is a setting where creation is never permanent, because every ordered world is also a target. That tension becomes clearer in the story of the Burning Legion itself. Sargeras, once a titan of immense strength, comes to believe that the only way to stop the corruption spreading through reality is to destroy worlds before worse threats can claim them. That answer is extreme, and it becomes the source of one of Warcraft's central conflicts. Instead of preserving life, the Legion turns conquest into a supposed solution. It brings demons, warlocks, corrupted armies, and endless invasion wherever it can reach. And that makes the Legion less a single enemy and more a recurring apocalypse. Azeroth is especially important because it is not just another world. It is a world with extraordinary potential, and that is why so many powers circle around it. The Titan's influence on the world leaves behind ancient structures and dormant systems. The Void sees it as a prize. The Legion sees it as a threat or an opportunity depending on the moment. Long before any human kingdom rises, Azeroth is already the center of a cosmic contest. That larger conflict also helps explain why the earliest ancient wars matter so much. When the Legion and other outside powers push into young worlds, they do more than start battles. They alter the development of entire races, corrupt cultures before they fully form, and force native peoples to survive in conditions they were never meant to face. In Warcraft, that pattern repeats constantly. A world is created, a force reaches for it, and the people who live there are left dealing with the aftermath. By the time the timeline reaches the earliest age of mortal history, Azeroth is already marked by these struggles. The Titans have left their legacy, the Legion has already proven it can return, and the Void remains a hidden pressure beneath the surface of events. That is the real starting point for everything that follows, a world made powerful on purpose, then exposed to enemies that want to claim, corrupt, or destroy it. From there, the story moves into the ancient wars that first break the world's surface history open. The next major turning point comes on Draenor, a world that never gets the chance to remain ordinary for long. Before it becomes the shattered outland known in later history, Draenor is home to the Draenei and the Orcs, two peoples whose paths are pulled together by outside powers and by their own choices. The Draenei arrive as refugees, fleeing the Burning Legion across worlds, while the Orcs grow up as a hardy native people with their own clans, traditions, and spiritual practices. For a time, those societies develop separately. Then the Legion finds another way in. That corruption of the orcs is one of the most important events in all Warcraft history because it turns a local conflict into a world-shaping disaster. Through manipulation and the promise of power, the orcs are pushed away from their ancestral ways and into a new identity built around conquest. The result is not just a war between clans or a clash with the Draenei, it becomes a larger campaign of destruction that sets the entire planet on course for collapse. The Legion does not simply want one army, it wants a world softened, divided, and made useful for its own purposes. Draenor's fall matters because it shows a pattern the rest of the setting keeps repeating. The Legion rarely arrives only as an invading force. It often works by bending existing societies until they destroy themselves. On Draenor, that means the orcs are turned into the main weapon of the invasion, and the Draenei become victims of a conflict they did not create. The devastation is severe enough that the world itself is eventually broken apart, leaving behind Outland as a ruin rather than a functioning homeland. By the end of that period, Draenor is no longer a stable center of life. It is a warning about what happens when corruption is allowed to spread unchecked. While Draenor is being consumed, another crucial chapter is unfolding on Azeroth. Long before the kingdoms of humans and orcs define the later age, the world is dominated by ancient powers and by the Night Elves, who live in a Kalimdor far larger and more unified than the continent remembered in later eras. At the heart of this society is the Well of Eternity, a source of magical power that also draws attention from forces outside the world. That power becomes the entry point for the Burning Legion. The War of the Ancients is where Warcraft's ancient history becomes unmistakably tragic. The Night Elves are not a young, fragile civilization at this point. They are already established, skilled, and deeply tied to magic. But the Legion's return turns that strength into vulnerability. What begins as abuse of power and a growing obsession with arcane magic escalates into open war, with the Highborn, the Night Elves, and the Invaders all caught in a conflict that threatens the world itself. This is not a small border war. It is a struggle over whether Azeroth will remain intact at all. The destruction that follows changes the map in the most literal way possible. The great landmass of Kalimdor is shattered, and the world is permanently altered by the catastrophe. This is why the ancient wars matter so much in the broader timeline. They are not just early battles before the real story begins. They are the events that decide what kind of world later ages inherit. The Night Elves survive, but they do so in a changed form, shaped by loss, isolation, and the consequences of relying on magic that has already proven too dangerous to ignore. The Burning Legion is pushed back during this era, but that is not the same as being destroyed. That distinction matters because Warcraft's history is full of enemies that return after apparent defeats. The Legion leaves behind damage, survivors, and unfinished business. The world is broken, the Night Elves are fundamentally changed, and the forces that caused the catastrophe remain out there, waiting for another opening. From this point forward, Azeroth is no longer just a young world exposed to cosmic pressure. It is a world already scarred by invasion, and everything that comes next will be built on the ruins of these ancient wars. With the old world broken, the story turns from cosmic disaster to mortal history. Azeroth is still recovering from the War of the Ancients when new peoples begin shaping the future in ways that will matter for every conflict after it. Warcraft stops being only a tale of titans, demons, and ancient magic, and becomes a story about kingdoms, alliances, invasions, and the people left to inherit a damaged world. One of the first major shifts happens on Draenor, where the Orc clans are once a fragmented people, tied to local loyalties rather than any common cause. That changes when Gul'dan and the Burning Legion meshvein. Through corruption and manipulation, the Orcs are turned from divided clans into an invading force. The Legion does not simply empower them, it redirects their history. The Orcs become the instrument of an outside power, and that leads directly to the first great war against Azeroth's human nations. At the same time, another displaced people enters the wider conflict. The Draenei flee Draenor under the pressure of the same forces of corruption and destruction, eventually becoming part of the long struggle against the Legion. Their presence matters because it ties Draenor's tragedy directly to Azeroth's future. Warcraft keeps linking these worlds through flight, pursuit, and survival. What happens on one world does not stay there for long. The first war is where those threads collide. The Horde crosses into Azeroth and attacks the kingdom of Stormwind. At this point, the Orcs are still strangers to most human kingdoms, and the scale of the threat is not fully understood until the fighting is already underway. Stormwind falls, and the survivors are pushed toward a wider alliance with other human powers. This is the beginning of the political structure that later becomes the Alliance, not an ideal first, but a response to catastrophe. Warcraft's great coalitions tend to form after disaster, not before it. The Second War expands that conflict across the continent. The human kingdoms, with allies at their side, push back against the Horde, while the orcs themselves become increasingly unstable as the power behind them starts to fray. This war matters not only because of who wins, but because it proves Azeroth is now a world of organized factions. Kingdoms no longer fight alone. Realms rise and break. Powers that once seemed secure can be forced into collapse. By the end of this era, the old Horde has been defeated. But the idea of the Horde survives, waiting to be reborn in another form. That rebirth becomes one of the defining developments in the timeline. Under leaders like Thrall, the orcs begin to recover an identity separate from Legion corruption. The Horde becomes a new coalition of peoples rather than a single race or a conquered army. The Alliance also hardens into a lasting force, centered on surviving human kingdoms and their partners. By this point, Azeroth has settled into a rivalry that will shape the modern era. Two major political blocs, each strong enough to change history, but neither able to secure lasting peace. Then Arthas enters the picture, and the conflict changes again. The fall of Lord Aeron is one of the great tragedies in Warcraft, because it shows the largest threat is no longer always coming from outside the world. Arthas begins as a prince trying to protect his people from the undead scourge, but that struggle pulls him deeper into corruption. His descent turns him into one of the central figures of the age, and Lord Aeron falls with him. The scourge spreads, kingdoms collapse, and the war against death itself becomes one of Azeroth's defining struggles. The Third War is where those disasters connect. It brings together the Legion's return, the rise of the scourge, the destruction of major human powers, and the transformation of the orcs into something new. It does not close one conflict cleanly and move on. It leaves the world full of unresolved damage. Northrend becomes tied to Arthas's fate. Kalimdor becomes home to old and new powers trying to survive. Lord Aeron is shattered. The Night Elves must adapt to a post-war world. And across it all, the Scourge remains active, ensuring that even after one enemy is beaten, another still presses on the world. By the time this era ends, the major powers of Azeroth are in place. The Alliance and Horde endure. The Scourge remains dangerous. The old kingdoms are wounded, but not erased. The world has entered a fragile balance built on the ruins of repeated wars. That is the real bridge into the age of World of Warcraft. Not peace, but exhaustion, rivalry, and the sense that every victory has only delayed the next crisis. When the Third War ends, Warcraft does not settle into peace. The surviving powers are too damaged to dominate, and every new threat arrives with the memory of the last one still fresh. That is what changes the World of Warcraft era. Conflicts stop staying local and start overlapping across the whole setting. Old enemies return, new factions appear, and the world that barely held together after Arthas's rise is forced into one crisis after another without much time to recover. The first expansion, the Burning Crusade, pulls the story back to Outland, the shattered remnant of Draenor. Here the consequences of the Orcs' past, the Draenei's exile, and the Legion's corruption all come back into view. Outland is more than a battlefield, it is what remains after the Burning Legion gets its way. The broken world becomes home to ruined civilizations, displaced refugees, and warlords who survived the collapse of the Old Order. Azeroth is no longer isolated either. The Dark Portal opens again, and the conflict expands into a wider struggle against demons, blood elves searching for a future, and competing forces trying to control what is left of a broken world. Northrend is the next major turning point. Wrath of the Lich King brings the story back to the Scourge at its most dangerous, and Arthas becomes the center of the death crisis that has been building for years. Northrend matters because it turns a long-running undead threat into a direct confrontation with its source. The Alliance and Horde both commit fully, but the conflict is bigger than faction rivalry. It is a war over whether death itself will keep spreading across Azeroth. The Lich King's fall does not erase the Scourge, but it does end one of the most terrifying forms the threat can take. It also changes the balance of power again, leaving a world already battered by demons and undead to deal with the aftermath. Cataclysm follows by showing that even after major villains are defeated, the world itself can still break apart. Deathwing's return tears through Azeroth and changes the landscape directly. This expansion shifts the story away from only reacting to outside invaders and toward dealing with damage rooted in the planet's own history. Old regions are remade, new tensions emerge, and the faction war becomes harder to contain because the world is literally changing under everyone's feet. The Horde and Alliance remain central, but they are now fighting in a setting destabilized at the deepest level. The result is less one war than a chain of collisions, with elemental forces, political conflict, and the fallout from earlier catastrophes all hitting at once. Mists of Pandaria changes the pace, but not the pressure. Pandaria introduces a hidden land with its own long history, and the arrival of the Alliance and Horde brings the faction war into a place that had been cut off from the larger world. That makes the story different, but not calmer. Instead of facing a familiar outside enemy, the factions expose their own instability. The Shah, tied to negative emotion and conflict, become a major danger, keeping the focus on how war spreads damage even when no conqueror is present. This chapter shows that Azeroth's weakness is not only demons or undead, it is its own tendency to escalate. By the end of Pandaria, the faction war has become destructive enough to open the door to a break from the main timeline. Warlords of Draenor follows that break back into the past, but it is not a simple return. It uses an alternate Draenor to explore what the Orc clans and the Draenei might have become under different conditions, while bringing the Iron Horde into conflict with the present. The expansion reconnects Warcraft's deepest history to the modern era without pretending the old damage never happened. It is still about Draenor, the Orcs, and the Legion's shadow over everything, but it also shows how a single unresolved choice can create a new war. The past in Warcraft never stays buried for long. Legion brings the Burning Legion back in full force, making it one of the clearest returns to the setting's oldest cosmic conflict. Azeroth faces a direct demonic invasion, and every old alliance, enemy, and surviving power is pushed into the same larger fight. The Legion's return also pulls in the history of the Titans, demon hunters, Argus, and the long chain of decisions that made the invasion possible. This is another example of how Warcraft layers history instead of replacing it. The Legion is ancient, but it arrives in the middle of faction exhaustion, world damage, and unresolved cosmic instability. Even victory comes with a cost that shapes the next era. Battle for Azeroth turns the focus back to faction war. But by now, the conflict is no longer just about territory. It is about what is left of trust after years of world-ending crises. The Alliance and Horde move toward direct confrontation again, while the deeper story keeps showing that Azeroth's surface wars are tied to older forces beneath them. The war strains every major power, and the result is less triumph than attrition. In Warcraft, exhaustion becomes part of the history. The factions do not reset after each war, they carry the damage forward. By the end of these eras, Warcraft has moved far beyond the old pattern of one great evil followed by one clean resolution. Outland, Northrend, Pandaria, Draenor, and the return of the Legion all point to the same truth in different ways. Azeroth survives by absorbing the consequences of earlier ages. The world is battered, its great powers are weakened, and every victory leaves something unfinished. That is the state the setting enters as the next crisis begins to rise. When the war with the Legion finally ends, Warcraft does not settle down. It moves into a new kind of danger, one where the biggest threats are no longer marching openly across the world, but pressing in from death itself, from ancient bloodlines, and from powers that have been sleeping beneath the surface. That is what makes the modern era so important in the timeline. It is not a clean aftermath, it is a chain reaction. The first major break comes with the death of the world soul and the crisis that follows. Sylvanas Windrunner shatters the helm of domination, and that act tears open the boundary between Azeroth and the Shadowlands. In practical terms, that means the normal order of life and death collapses. The dead are being pulled away in huge numbers, the flow of souls is disrupted, and the realms that were supposed to remain separate begin to spill into each other. What follows is not just a rescue mission, it is a full confrontation with the machinery of death itself. Shadowlands shifts the scale of the story again. Instead of one kingdom or one continent, the conflict reaches into the afterlife and reveals just how much of Warcraft has always depended on systems mortals barely understood. The Covenants, the Maw, the Jailer, and the larger truth about soul imprisonment all show that even death had become unstable long before anyone on Azeroth realized it. By the end of that crisis, the immediate threat is contained, but the cost is enormous. The balance between life and death has been damaged, and the world comes back changed. In Warcraft, even a victory over death does not restore innocence. It only proves how deep the damage already was. That leads into the return of the Dragonflights and the oldest powers tied to Azeroth itself. Dragonflight turns the timeline away from cosmic apocalypse for a moment and back toward the world's original defenders. The aspects are no longer what they once were, and the Dragonflights are forced to confront the loss of their old purpose, their broken inheritance, and the question of whether they can still protect a world that keeps moving past them. At the same time, the primal forces they face are not minor local threats. The primal incarnates and the rise of elemental rebellion point to a deeper instability in the world's design, one that reaches back to the earliest shaping of Azeroth. This is what makes the modern Warcraft timeline feel different from the older one. Earlier eras often built toward a single war or a single villain. Now the story keeps layering crises on top of each other. Death is destabilized, dragonkind is tested, elemental powers rise again, and the world's defenders are stretched thinner every time. Even when one threat is contained, another is already surfacing. The setting no longer moves from peace to war and back again. It moves from one unfinished consequence to the next. That is also why the current state of the world feels so fragile. The factions are still present, but they are not in a position to dominate everything the way they once tried to. The great powers have been weakened by repeated conflict, and the forces underneath Azeroth are no longer theoretical. They are active, political, and dangerous. The world is still standing, but it is standing on accumulated damage. Each era has exposed something older and more unstable beneath the one before it. So by the time Warcraft reaches the present day, the story has moved far beyond simple survival. The Alliance and Horde are still part of it, but they are no longer the whole of it. Death has been breached, dragons have returned to an uncertain role, primal forces are stirring, and the world itself seems to be moving toward a reckoning it has not yet fully revealed. Azeroth is not at peace. It is waiting, under strain, with ancient powers awakening again, and the next chapter already pressing in. By this point, the pattern is clear. Warcraft does not tell a single straight-line history. It moves from cosmic creation to the ordering of Azeroth, to the rise of mortal civilizations, and then into repeated collision between those mortals and the powers above, below, and beyond them. The Titans shape the world. The old gods poison it. The Burning Legion turns it into a battlefield. The Horde and Alliance inherit the damage and keep the conflict going, even as greater threats keep breaking through. That is the full shape of Warcraft's timeline. Creation, corruption, resistance, and survival. Every age leaves behind a stronger wound, and every victory buys only a little more time. The story has never been about one final piece. It has always been about what endures long enough to face the next disaster. And in Warcraft, the next reckoning is never far away.